Then, since I think it's time. All right, so before we get started, who here is a PHP developer? Just curious to see who I'm talking to. Got a, maybe? Cool. What other languages do people do? C#? Yeah. Java? Cool. Nice. Okay, so got a mixed crowd. Okay, so first question, well, first thing is, who am I? Why am I up here talking about PHP? Well, I describe myself as a crusted-on PHP developer. I've been doing it for 20 years. I've been a senior PHP developer for, 13 years or something. And I've been doing PHP security for about 7 years. So I've been doing this for a while. PHP is my language of choice. It's a language I love working with, language I use every day. And I figured I should defend it since it's such a great language. What else have I got on there? So I spent about 18 months cleaning infected WordPress sites, which was actually really, really fascinating. Looking at malware and viruses and the way that people compromise WordPress sites and what's going on in that ecosystem. So that was quite fun and gave me a unique insight into what's going on in the PHP community and specifically WordPress. I learned a lot more about WordPress than I ever thought I would doing that job. It was lots of fun. So last year, I stopped being a developer and started being a security consultant and doing pen tests and security audits. And so I spent the year auditing Laravel sites and finding security vulnerabilities and hacking into them, and then obviously reporting those to the clients. And so that's given me a good insight into what's going on in the PHP community in terms of security, rather than just as a developer, but seeing what other people are doing and reading other people's code. And then in October last year, I thought, what the hell, let's submit a PHP talk to NDC, because I hadn't seen any PHP talks at NDC before, and there's always a few negative PHP jokes, so let's defend PHP, submit a talk. It was kind of a joke. I submitted it kind of a joke, but also as a serious topic, because I do feel strongly about it. And they accepted, so here I am, let's defend PHP. So why am I defending PHP apart from the fact that I love it so much? Well, there are three main reasons. The first one is that it's unfairly attacked. PHP is constantly the butt of jokes. It's constantly being attacked, constantly being unfairly attacked. Well, the words I got on there. So it's constantly being put down. And in my view, that is unfair. I think there are so many reasons why, there's so many arguments that are put up against PHP that just don't make any sense. They're outdated, they're irrelevant, they're based on older versions of PHP, old applications, and they don't really make any sense anymore, but people still keep coming out with the same reasons, the same arguments. And it just gets old. Frankly, it's just old to hear the same tired arguments again and again attacking PHP. So I figured I'd do something about it. And finally, a lot of people don't realize this, but modern PHP frameworks are actually really, really secure. They have a big focus on security. They put a lot of effort into building secure defaults. And so building an application in modern PHP now is actually really easy and really secure because you've got the frameworks and the things in place to give you that security. So now before we proceed, there is the running joke on the internet, I don't know if you've heard of it before, but is PHP dead? It goes around every so often. You'll get some rubbish article mentioning PHP is a dying language. I don't think so. Like 77.8% of the internet is running PHP. It's not dead. Look at everything else by comparison. Single digits, PHP. It's not dead. Now, PHP, there are I categorize two different parts of PHP. You've got legacy PHP and modern PHP. And legacy PHP is kind of where the problems are and the insecurities are. Modern PHP doesn't have any of that. But people are always talking about legacy PHP and thinking about legacy PHP, and it's kind of where the bad reputation comes from in a sense. So let's look at the history of PHP, where it came from and to where it is now, to get a better understanding of why, what happened, and what caused the divide between legacy and modern. So back in '94, PHP, Personal Homepage Tools was created by Rasmus Lerdoff, and I apologize for butchering the names. I'm Australian, it's what we do. So it was originally called Personal Homepage Tools, shortened to PHP Tools, and it was a private project by Rasmus. And he created it in '94 because he was trying to set up, I think it was his resume on his site, and he wanted some analytics and some basic things like that, some stats and such going on to see who's visiting his site. So he put together what he called PHP Tools as a way to do that, to gain that inside information, because there was obviously nothing else that he could use that did what he wanted. And then in June of 95, he released the source code, so he open sourced it. And you can see there's the release post he put up there if you're interested. So that was in June 95 where he open sourced PHP Tools version 1.0. And then in September of 95, He did a major expansion on the toolkit, added more to it, renamed it to Forms Interpreter because he obviously didn't like the name PHP Tools. I'm not sure Forms Interpreter was a better name, but anyway. So he did that, and it included a bunch of things like form variables and HTML embedded stuff and all the things you needed to do forms and everything else. Hence, you can figure out why he got to that name. So that was September of 95. And then in October 95, we had a complete rewrite. And we also had a new name. There's a pattern here you might notice. So we had a new name, Personal Homepage Construction Kit. And at the time, whatever Personal Homepage Construction Kit, as it was called, was an advanced scripting interface. So it was advanced for what it did at its time, and it was really good at what it did, even, for what it was. So that was basically version 1 of PHP or PHP Tools or Construction Kit or Forms Interpreter, whatever you want to call it. Version 1 was that, a really basic, simple scripting interface that you could use for doing forms and analytics and stuff like that. And then PHP/FI 2.0 came along. So it was a complete makeover. The words in all the articles I found said complete makeover. I'm guessing it was just a complete rewrite. Notice the pattern. It was also renamed. We have PHP-FI now, which has both the names in it, that had support for databases and cookies and functions and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. So that came out in June of 96, or the beta came out in June of 96, and then in November of 97 you had the final version. And you can see here an example of what the code used to look like. It was all done through HTML comments, which is quite a fascinating way to do it and kind of reminds me of things like Vue and React now, where you've got stuff all interspersed in HTML, which is just weird. But anyway, we do have the wonderful $ variables, which I love. Some people hate, but they were back there at version 2, so they're cool. And according to a Netcraft survey in 98, PHP-FI 2.0 was on 1% of domains on the internet, which is a significant amount for this little project this guy was running to run analytics on his resume. That's kind of cool. That's kind of where it started. So that was the version 2 stages. So after version 2, we had version 3. So Andy Gutmans and Zeev Sereski, again, I apologize for the names, joined Rasmus in 97, and they had a plan to build a new engine and build a new way of doing PHP and make it more extensible. And so they did a complete rewrite. And they also renamed it. And this time it's called PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. And this is the final name. So PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, which is a recursive acronym. So PHP 3 was born at this point, had strong extensibility features and support for multiple databases, APIs, etc. Basically, the idea was that it supported heaps of things, and if it didn't do what you wanted, you could easily add support for it into the language as well, because it was so easy to extend. So that was released in June of 98, and it was already running on over 70,000 domains at that point. So the betas and the alphas and everything else were being tested and used by 70,000 domains already before they launched the final version. That's how popular it was and how good at what it did it was. And in September of 98, we have PHP My Admin, which it shocked me to find out that it started back in the PHP 3 days. I didn't realize it was that early. But yes, PHP My Admin starts then. And PHP 3 was on 10% of web servers at its peak, at its most used level, which is pretty impressive again for this little project. So that's PHP 3. Now, when I was researching PHP 3, I stumbled upon this. A function in PHP that it leaks memories. It leaks a specified amount of memory. So yeah, that apparently useful for debugging back in the day. Yeah, I'm sure we all know what we think of that function. Now, this handy person here said, guess what with the result of that uploaded to an HTTP transport, blah, blah. You've got remote code execution, file upload stuff. This helpful person responds and goes, just throw a grep in there, just run a grep via cron, and you can see who's doing it. So they're not saying stop it or anything, control it. They just want, just have an eye on who's doing what with it. Really? That's your solution? So this helpful person responds, wouldn't it be more elegant to just disable it? Because PHP had a disabled functions feature. You could just turn off any feature in PHP that you didn't want them to use, which is really handy for a feature like leak. And the helpful person down here goes, he's talking about tracking it, not disabling it. Really? It's a leak function. It leaks memory. Really? We want this? Anyway, that's PHP 3 and 4. So PHP 4. Anyone call out for the new rewrite? Anyone guess that one was coming? Because it came. So PHP 4 was a complete rewrite. built on the Zend engine this time, which was a new way to build PHP and support more extensibility, customization, all those big fancy words. As you can see from the release announcement here, there was just so much in the language that there was no point trying to explain all of it. They just generic statement of lots of improvements, yay. So that was PHP 4. It was released in May of 2000. Pair started in March of 2000. Pair is PHP's first package manager. We'll get to it later. We also had the, I don't know, what would you call it, the unholy trinity of PHP applications. Drupal, Moodle, and WordPress all started around this time as well. And so they all started in the WordPress, the PHP 4 era. And they're all still hanging on today. I'm sure we all have thoughts about them. We will get to some of them later as well. So that was PHP 4 when it came out. So after PHP 4, we had PHP 5. And let's just up the drama a bit, and I'll make each thing reveal as I click the buttons. So we got 5 was released in July of 04, 5.1 November 05, 5.2 November 06. Everything seems to be tracking along pretty nicely here. And incidentally, PHP 5 was the most popular version until 2013, which is a really long time. You can probably guess what happens at this point. Things slow down. So these versions of PHP has come out, and then we've got PHP 5.3 in June of 2009. So there's a big gap in there, and we'll get to that in a sec. But PHP 3 also included namespaces and a bunch of other drastic changes. It really should have been a major version, like PHP 6 or something. But it wasn't. That's one of the reasons why so many people stayed on PHP 5.2, I should say. So around this era, you also had a bunch of frameworks being created. You've got Symfony, CodeIgniter, Zen Framework, etc. And these are all starting the move towards modern PHP and modern frameworks and applications in PHP rather than using the old legacy systems like WordPress and such. In 2009, we had the PHP Fig, which is the Framework Interoperability Group. And that's really where modern PHP started. Because the group started and they developed PSR 0, which is the PHP Standard Recommendation. Yeah, PHP Standard Recommendation. And that was the autoloading standard. And I'll explain what that is in a sec. We're just jumping quickly through history here. Now, around the time of all of these versions, we had PHP 6 was started. And there's even a book. You could buy a book. I think you can possibly still buy it today. You can buy a book on PHP 6. Anyway, so it was started in August 2005, before PHP 5.1. And the idea was to add Unicode support to the language. So, yeah, because PHP was terrible at Unicode at that point. So they wanted to add Unicode support, make some optimizations and changes, basically improve the language. It was abandoned in March of 2010. It took them so long to make it work, it just didn't work. Eventually, they just gave up and threw it away. They just could not make PHP 6 work. And this is one of the reasons why 5.3 is 5.3 instead of 6, because it came out around here somewhere when 6 was still planned to be 6, and changing the numbers would have been hell. So anyway, they abandoned PHP 6, and PHP 6 has never been released. It's not a valid version number, but you can still buy a book. I should really get one. That'd be cool. I should have brought it as a prop. That would be great. Anyway, so that was PHP 6, which we don't talk about much. After PHP 6 was killed, we went on to PHP 5.4. That was March 2012. 5.5, 5.6 came out then. And we can see we're back to a decent cadence in years. We've no longer got the large multi-year stretches between the versions. We now have, 12, 13, 14. And in this time, in 2011, we get Laravel framework coming out and the Guzzle package. Two are very significant things. Laravel, we'll get to in a sec. And in August of 2011, Composer gets released. I'll get to that shortly as well, but that's a huge milestone as well. It's kind of the big technical point at which modern PHP became a thing after the PHP Fig, the standards, came out. April of 2012, we have this thing being published, blog post called PHP A Fractal of Bad Design, which is basically an outdated and irrelevant blog post of reasons why the author doesn't like PHP, even though half the things they came out with when they wrote the post were wrong and the rest of them are completely irrelevant and out of date now. It's over 10 years old and it still gets referenced to this day. People still talk about this article and link to it, and it drives us all nuts because it's rubbish. Most of it is wrong and the rest of it got fixed ages ago. Around the same time, we also had PHP the Right Way was created, which is basically a web book for how to build PHP applications properly. I think it was in response to A Fractal of Bad Design, and it goes through step by step all the different things you need to pay attention to when you're building a PHP app. So it's a great resource. But so they all happened in 2012 in part of the PHP 5 versions. Then after PHP 5, we went on to 7 because 6 is gone. And there's not too much to say here except for we had a bunch of different releases, one after another each of the years. Each version makes the language significantly better, adds new features, adds cool stuff. We're not going into the details in the talk. The point is that we're on a nice solid cadence here. So where did it all go wrong? What went wrong with PHP and why do people have a problem with PHP? And you've probably already figured it out, but it's the PHP 3 and 4 era, which is, roughly those years. So PHP 3 and 4, the problem was that it was a really powerful language and it did a whole bunch of stuff, but there were no checks in it. There was no structure in it. And so it was really, really easy to make big mistakes. It basically gave you all power and no safety. And in order to get any structure in your applications, to do any sort of decent application structure, and I'm repeating the word structure, but the point is, in order to do any of that, you needed to build it yourself and manage it yourself through the functions that the language provided, because they didn't have namespaces or decent classes or anything like that. And so you're limited by what you implemented in your application, which meant that if you'd made some bad decisions early on, you're stuck with them, which makes it really hard to maintain a solid and secure application. Now, the other big problem with PHP at this time was the double-edged sword of shared hosting. Because back then, shared hosting was cheap and nasty. You got it for free, you got it for maybe $5 a year, $5 a month if you found a really expensive shared host. And they all had PHP because it was free and easy. And so anyone who wanted an application would set up would get shared hosting for paying basically no money, and then use PHP and figure out how to write it from there. And then, of course, these people that don't know what they're doing are setting up their hosting account and then writing their own PHP. Of course, they're going to write security vulnerabilities because they don't know what they're doing. Shared hosting also installed applications for you. I think like Plesk and cPanel had, was it Fantastico maybe? I don't know if anyone remembers those wonderful, glorious shared hosting days. But yeah, and so shared hosting would install applications for you, so non-technical users could literally just go into the web interface, click a few buttons, have a version of WordPress installed, or Moodle, or Drupal, or any of the other things. But none of them would get updated or managed, and the settings would be rubbish anyway. And the non-technical people don't know what they're doing, so they're not going to fix anything. So you've got a whole pile of PHP applications configured and set up that people don't know how to use, don't know how to manage or secure, and aren't getting updated. And that's all brought about from shared hosting. And granted, shared hosting also is probably the reason why PHP is so popular, because it was so easy to use and get to, but it's a double-edged sword. Also, it was pretty common to have display errors on by default back in those days. And display errors, of course, leak information application, and if you're trying to hack things, break into stuff, steal data, you can do it through display errors as well. So that was happening in that era as well. And there was no decent package manager, no way to pull in common packages, reuse packages, no way to update things when there are security updates. So you're basically stuck with old versions. As you can see, these are the main applications you think of when you're thinking of this era. Cool. So as I mentioned before, PER, PHP extension, what's it called? PHP extension and application repository. So it's PHP's early package manager, but it was kind of exclusive. They only supported one package that did a certain job. So if you wanted to do testing and you wanted to use a PER package, you had to use PHP unit. If you wanted to do code styling, you had to use their code sniffer. If you wanted to do this thing, you had to use that. Want to do that, you had to do that. You couldn't use anything else. It was also installed on a system level. So to do any sort of updates or installs, you had to be the admin of the box or have elevated privileges to do it. And everything was installed on system level. So if you've got 3 applications, they all had to use the same version because they were all accessing the common PER repository on the server. So if this site over here requires a really old version, you can't update it if your site wants a new one because this site's going to break. And if you tie that back to shared hosting, one of the big problems with shared hosting is that the hosts don't want to update anything. They don't want to do any updates at all. Because if you've got, say, 150 clients on a server, and half of them require an old version of PHP, and you update it to a new version, they're going to break. And keep in mind, these customers pay you $5 a year at most, which means that as soon as their site goes down, they will literally call you up and scream in your ear they're losing thousands of dollars a minute because their site is down. Trust me, I worked in shared hosting. I know. And yeah, so these customers that pay you basically no money at all are the ones that yell the loudest about their sites being down. And so you don't update anything, you don't touch anything, because if you break something, then you're going to get screamed at by the customers that don't pay you enough to listen to them. And so in shared hosting, what you end up with is old servers running old versions, and the newer servers running new versions. And if a customer wants a new version, you migrate them to a new server. And it just gets a complete mess if old versions everywhere and things get more vulnerable and it just escalates and it's hell, right? Back to my point of shared hosting being horrible. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So Pair. Where was I up to? I got lost track of what I was up to. So Pair was difficult to use, if you haven't got that already. And basically, no one wanted to use it because it was so difficult to use. And so you just copy and pasted code, or you built your own code. You didn't actually use Pair's packages for much because it was just too much of a hassle. Luckily for us, Pair is dead. Completely gone and buried and gone. Yay, Pair is dead. If there were more PHP developers, we'd be cheering right now. Okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Sorry, my jokes are terrible, aren't they? Okay, another fun one, PHP-MyAdmin. So PHP-MyAdmin suffers from the set and forget mentality. You'd install it to use it for one thing, like you had to update a field in the database. So you'd install PHP-MyAdmin, go into the field, update it, and then you'd forget you left PHP-MyAdmin installed. And then a hacker comes along later and discovers it and brute forces your database credentials and then gets into your database and does whatever it is they want to do. Happened all the time. We saw it all the time when cleaning infected sites. And you'd always find PHP-MyAdmin sitting in a subdirectory on the website somewhere because they had to use it for one thing. And you've got the same problem with the shared hosting and the non-technical people not knowing what they're doing. And so they're going to upload it and configure it with their passwords because they don't have to type them in, which means that you have a PHP-MyAdmin without a password prompt that gets you straight into the customer's database, sitting on a subdirectory on their site. And so that's one of the problems with PHP-MyAdmin. I mean, it was a fantastic tool for what it did. It did the job well, and it was really the only option you had back in those days. But it also caused so many problems because you would forget about it and leave it there. And you got abandoned sites sitting there for ages with this running. And so then a hacker's going to find it months or years later. WordPress also came around in the same time. The thing about WordPress is it's full of legacy code patterns because it was built during the PHP 4 era where they weren't classes and other structures. And so they had to build their own structures for everything. And they also have really strong backwards compatibility guidelines, which means you cannot delete any functions. You cannot remove a function out of WordPress or do any major refactoring and restructuring of how it works. It has to keep working on the sites that are running it. So you end up with a whole bunch of legacy patterns and legacy requirements in WordPress because of how it was built and because of the fact that it's the thing's 20 years old. You also have the problem that it's on at the moment, 43% of websites, which means that it has a humongous user base and you cannot simply change something and go, oh, if it breaks for your site, who cares? Because that is a huge amount of sites that are going to break. And so you need to support these sites. WordPress, because there weren't any decent package managers and anything like that, everything is self-contained. So any of the components that it uses have vulnerabilities. You have to update all of WordPress core. You have the same problem with abandoned sites. So people setting up a WordPress site and forgetting it's been there. And then it's going to, it's just going to sit there for months and years being unused and outdated. And then someone's going to come along, discover it and hack it. We saw that all the time. In fact, when cleaning WordPress sites, you'd often find a hacker who'd been in there for a couple of years, or even multiple layers of hacks. So you'll be going through and you'll find some really old, vulnerable, malicious code that's sitting in there doing something quietly and no one's noticed it because they haven't broken the site. And then recently someone else has hacked in and broken the site, and that's why they've got you to clean it, because they've realized they've been hacked. But years ago, they were hacked and doing other malicious things. It's very common on WordPress. You've got non-technical site owners, so the guy down the road that runs a shop doesn't know technology. They've got like their cousin's kid or their neighbor's kid to set up the WordPress site for them, pay them $20. Kid's installed WordPress, hasn't really put any care into it. He's just getting $20. Install it, takes 5 minutes, done. No one knows how to run it. No one manages it. All the site owner does is log in occasionally to respond to comments, and the site gets hacked because no one does updates. And everyone's afraid of doing updates too. But the real problem with WordPress isn't the WordPress core. It's actually pretty secure. So at the moment, WordPress requires PHP 7.4, which is slightly out of date, but they brought it up recently. It was a lot older version recently that it required, but they brought that one up. But it also includes automatic updates, which means that WordPress core will automatically update when there are security updates. So as long as you're maintaining your WordPress enough for it to do updates, any security vulnerabilities in WordPress core will be updated and your site will be protected. There is an incredibly active security team working at WordPress who look at security vulnerabilities and things and reports, and if there are any issues with plugins and themes, then they'll respond to those. And in general, the WordPress core itself, the actual WordPress itself, the code is pretty secure. It's very rare for them to be vulnerabilities in the WordPress core that are exploited in the wild before they're fixed. They do occasionally get found and then fixed, and then they get exploited after that, after an update goes out, but it's rare for it to be hacked before the update, before people know about it. So you're ready to have a 0 day. There's also an incredibly active security ecosystem around WordPress. Like WordFence, the company I used to work for, their thing is WordPress security. They make a firewall and a vulnerability scanner, and we clean infected sites. So there's huge security stuff around WordPress. The problem are the vulnerable plugins and themes. Because these are people that don't really know what they're doing, but they want their site to do something specific. And so they'll create their own plugin for WordPress to do what they want because they can't find one that does what they want. And because it's so easy to get started building a plugin or just doing PHP in general, and these people don't really know what they're doing, they're just trying to scratch an itch, they're going to produce rubbish plugins, rubbish code, which then is what gets hacked. And so the majority of stuff in WordPress that gets hacked are the plugins and the themes, because they're the vulnerable bits, the bits that are sitting on top. And I still have nightmares of logging into some infected sites and seeing 30 or 40 different WordPress plugins installed. Anyway, at WordPress, same problem with shared hosting we've been in before. The other big problem that WordPress has, though, is there's no multi-factor in the core. So just resulting in passwords. And the WordPress community has a strange obsession with random, unique usernames. They don't talk about passwords being random and unique. They talk about usernames being random and unique, which is bizarre because WordPress literally tells you the username if you ask for it. So yeah, I've sat through talks before where the speaker has talked about unique random passwords. Unique random usernames and not mention the password, and it was just weird. Anyway, here's the WordPress stats just to kind of prove that WordPress is used a lot. I'm sure we already know these numbers. Anyway, it's pretty impressive that all the competitors are down here and WordPress is still massive up there. And that's kind of one of the problems with WordPress in the sense that it's got so much momentum behind it for such a legacy project, which makes it such a huge, huge target. Is that, there's me? There we go. Sorry, my clicker doing weird stuff. Okay, now the other problem in the PHP 3 and 4 era was the roll your own, which is where the barrier to entry for PHP is really low. It's really, really easy to build PHP apps. All you have to do is one line and you can print something on the screen. You add that into the widespread availability of shared hosting. It's free or really, really cheap, that sort of thing. It's really easy to do. What am I trying to say? Sorry, I completely lost my train of thought. It's really, really easy to build your own PHP sites, and the PHP 3 and 4 era had a lot of this happening, and you combine that with lots of quick and dirty tutorials on the internet, and you get a world of pain. Because this is example code from a tutorial that I found online. It took me 5 seconds to find it. It was the top hit in Google for a simple search term, and this is the code from an actual tutorial that someone is teaching about PHP, and it's been around for years. Anyone notice the problem? Oh, one of the problems. Yep. So yeah, this one's kind of scary. And this is the common tutorial, and this person has never actually bothered to fix it, even though it's been online for years and people have left multiple comments about it. This person has never fixed it. And so this is one of the problems with the PHP 3 and 4 era, is that everyone's building their own thing and finding dodgy tutorials from someone who wrote it quickly and doesn't really care. They're not interested in security. They just want people on their site. So they're writing this rubbish. And then you result in hacked sites and vulnerable sites. So I went to, a couple of years ago, NDC Security in the Gold Coast, and I went through Troy Hunt's workshop. And he spent half the time making fun of me because he found out I was a PHP developer. And so I asked him, why do you pick on PHP so much? And so he opened a web browser and did this, typed that in there, first hit in Google, and we had this. So he went to the URL and he added the apostrophe up in there. And this kind of proves the problem with legacy PHP. Is there are a lot of sites out there like this that still have display errors and problems in SQL injection because they're just abandoned. I don't know if this site still gets used or not, but it's still online. And so PHP does have the negative connotations from the legacy side of things. And it's just the size and scale of PHP on the internet makes it hard to get rid of this. But that's kind of where the negative stuff comes from. But PHP 5 and beyond, things changed, things got better. So one of the things that happened during the PHP 5 era was setting up a release cadence. And as you'll notice when we went through the timeline of releases, that the years were every year. And so what they did was they switched to 2 years of active support for each version, and then a year of security support for the version. And you can see here, each year they're releasing, and then you've got the 8.1, 8.2 with the currently active support, and then you've got 8.0 has security support. And so the point of this is to keep the language moving and keep it going along. And then all the frameworks and all the tools that want to remain relevant in the space need to keep updated as well, which in turn keeps security updates and everything else moving along, because things have to keep up with this cadence, otherwise they're going to fall behind. And I think this is one of the things that helped WordPress get into where it is now with its updated versions and things. So I mentioned the PHP Fig before. So PHP Fig is the PHP Framework Interoperability Group, and it's a group of leaders from various frameworks and community groups in the PHP community that came together, and they developed a list of standards. And they started off with the PSR0 autoloading standard, which is probably the most significant of the list, although it's been replaced by 4 now, but it's the most significant of the list, and this is what it looks like. So the autoloading standard defines how different packages and different projects in PHP should structure their code, so that you can take anyone else's package and plug it into your program, into your app. And the idea is that rather than having to figure out how every different package does their thing, because everything was different before this. You had to do require statements, and all the naming was different, and you had conflicts and version problems and all the naming issues. But then the autoloading standard came out and did some really cool things. So first of all, up here, you've got the following structure. You've got a vendor name, namespace, and then class name. So vendor name is the vendor. It's like the user or the company. In my case, it's Valoran. And then you've got namespace. It starts off with the project name. So one of my packages is Valoran/point_password/ whatever the class names are. And what this means is that every bit of PHP you try to pull in that uses the autoloading standard is versioned to the vendor first. So you're never going to get a conflict between vendors because they all have their own name. And then you've got the package and so on from there. And then using PHP's autoloading, all you had to do is include the one file, then it would automatically find all these files for you. So using and reusing other people's code was really, really easy from this point because you didn't have to deal with all the messy naming problems. You could just drop the code in and that would work. And following on from the heels of this, we had Composer, which is PHP's package manager. And in my opinion, it is the best package manager that's ever been made. So PHP uses the autoloading standard to make it really, really easy to pull in PHP packages from packages, which is the repository. And unlike things like NPM, because it uses the vendor name first, you're never going to get never going to get name conflicts. It's really hard to get typo squatting unless you're actually typo squatting the vendor as well, because you need to get the vendor and then the package name. So typo squatting is a lot harder in this. It also does it per project dependencies rather than on the server, which is something that Pear was doing. So each project can have its own versions and pull in everything else rather than having to rely on the server, which solves that problem. And an easy version locking that was by default from the start, something that NPM took forever to add in, I might add. And so that made it really easy to ensure that the versions of the packages you're using on your local development are on the deployments, etc. It pulls it all from GitHub and other repositories as well. So the code you're getting is the code in the public repository, not some other package that's been put to the repository. So it gives you that awareness as well in there, which is nice. And there were no external dependencies. You didn't need to install anything on the system to use it. It's just a PHP file, which made it really, really easy to use and implement in your applications because you didn't need to ask the administrator to add anything. It was just there and ready to go. Basically, Composer made it really, really easy to reuse common components. So no longer were you re-implementing everything from scratch or manually copy-pasting code. You would just use a Composer to install it and then update it using a simple command, which solved a lot of the problems, and it really brought about modern PHP because it gave all of the magic package management stuff that you needed to build proper applications and keep them updated. There are also a bunch of third-party tools you can use for checking Composer packages to make sure they're updated. There are no known vulnerabilities, and they've recently added in Composer Audit as well, which does the same thing as part of Composer. So it makes it really easy to check for known vulnerabilities and keep things updated, and it pulls from GitHub's vulnerability database, etc. And then following on from Composer, we had the frameworks coming in, which were using Composer to pull in the packages. And the benefit of this is that common packages like I mentioned, Guzzle before, and Doctrine. And so the frameworks could use those rather than having to build their own wrapper around curl. So Guzzle is the wrapper around curl that makes it really easy to do HTTP requests and things. And rather than having to re-implement your own, you could just use Guzzle, which is a rock-solid package, and then everyone can use it. There's a logging package, a monolog, which everything uses. And so the idea was the frameworks made it really easy to reuse code and use common, trusted, well-used, well-known code rather than having to rebuild their own all the time. So the PHP frameworks in the 5, 6, 7, 8 era, not 6, 5, 7, you know what I mean. The frameworks, they follow security best practices mostly. And so when you deploy, when you start building an application using a PHP framework, one of the modern frameworks, you're getting best practices out of the box. You're not needing to learn security on your own or figure out how to solve the problems. It comes for you. They give you rock solid scaffolding for things like authentication and session and cookies and database connections, and all the different things you need in your application. It comes in the framework. So again, you don't have to implement that stuff. You just do your application logic. You don't have to set up all the rest of the nonsense. They're using Composer, as I mentioned before, for common dependencies. They have really active communities around them. Like Laravel, which is the most popular PHP framework, has a huge community around it, teaching best practices, and not just in security, but in coding in general. And because of the built-in security features within the frameworks and the communities around telling you how to use them and the best way to build your applications, it makes it really easy to build solid, secure applications using these frameworks because it gives you all those tools and all the knowledge you need to use them, rather than having to figure it out for yourself and figure out how to roll your own security, which never works well. As a good example, so in Laravel, in order to add CSRF protection, so cross-site request forgery protection, it's actually enabled by default. Anytime you deploy a Laravel application, unless you change the settings, in order to submit a form to it, you need to add in a CSRF token. This little bit up here, wait, I've got a slide for this. That little thing up there, those 5 characters are all you need to get CSRF protection in Laravel. That's it. It does everything else for you. It checks the requests coming in and blocks anything that's missing that token. So CSRF isn't a problem in Laravel because it's just there by default. You have to actively disable it in order to introduce a CSRF vulnerability. Oops. Okay, SQL injection is another one that the frameworks get rid of because you've got a fluent in-code way of doing SQL queries. You're not going to have parameterization issues and injection problems if you're writing your code like this, because here's your parameter here and the code automatically knows it has to escape that. You actually have to go out of your way to add in raw database clauses in order to get any form of injection vector. And again, they're really easy to add parameters into because it's all part of the syntax. And Cake PHP's got a similar thing over there. So the frameworks make it really easy to avoid issues like this. And I rarely see SQL injection vulnerabilities in modern PHP frameworks because they give you this and it just makes it so easy to write the secure code. Cross-site scripting is another one. You've got Blade templating, Twig templating, a bunch of templating engines that out of the box do escaping for you. So these double curlies, they escape things. So by default, when you're outputting stuff onto the screen, it's automatically escaped. Cross-site scripting isn't really a problem. You've also got advanced things like loops and if statements and continues and etc. For doing your scripting, you don't have to embed manual PHP into the template. You use the templating engine, which means you're less likely to get manual PHP, which has vulnerabilities in it. So cross-site scripting is not really a thing either that you see unless it's in special cases. Content security policy, if you're using, what is it? That one's CodeIgniter. CodeIgniter by default comes with a content security policy class. That's its default settings. It is turned off by default, but all you have to do is toggle a Boolean variable, and then you get content security policy being delivered in your application straight away. So piece of cake to add a content security policy in CodeIgniter. If you're running Cake PHP, you've got a whole bunch of functions here out of the box to enable various security headers in your application. Again, it's just a single line to turn on like referrer policy or the defunct XSS protection one. So really, really simple out-of-the-box framework gives it to you automatically. And it's worth pointing out that the other languages like Laravel, adding in these sorts of headers and adding content security policies is really simple. It's just, in Laravel for content security policy, I have a GitHub gist that has 2 files in it. You just put them into your Laravel application and it gives you content security policy. It's that simple to add them in. There's not the complexity needed to add these structures into your applications. They're just there. Authentication scaffolding is important too, and you get those. Laravel gives you Breeze and Jetstream, which are 2 fully featured authentication systems. A couple of command lines, and it installs it all for you. Then you have an application that, in the case of Jetstream, does login and registration and 2-factor authentication and password reset and user profile management. You can see sessions as well and kick other users out of your sessions. So it does all these different things, and that's just like 3 lines in your console to install and get all the dependencies in there. CodeIgniter has Shield, which I haven't used, but I think it does a similar sort of thing. It gives you the full authentication scaffolding. There are also a bunch of third-party packages in Composer and packages that give you passkeys and U2Fs, TOTPs. And there's also packages that do secure billing as well, integrate with Stripe and Paddle and a bunch of those other billing systems. And all of that is really easy out-of-the-box type stuff. You just get install the default application, then run a few more commands to pull in extra packages. It'll configure it all itself for you, And then you have an application where you can start doing your application logic, and you have all the authentication already set up for you. You don't have to worry about any of it, which is really, really cool. PHP by default, so not just the framework, but PHP by default has this function here, filter input, which you can use for validating inputs and also sanitizing inputs as well. So any user input you've got coming in, you can pass it through here, make sure it's in the right format, and get rid of any of the stuff you don't want to be in there. So it makes filtering and validating inputs really, really simple. In Laravel, it has over 90 different validators that you can use for validating your input, and the validator itself is really, really easy to use. These are a couple of my favorites, but you can see there's heaps of different options in here. And if you look at the password one, you can just configure the password rules like that. So if you need minimum of eight characters, you need it to be mixed case, etc., you can do that. And out of the box, Laravel gives you uncompromised, which calls the Pwned Passwords API. So you can check your passwords haven't been compromised and prevent people from using them in registration, password change, that sort of thing. So really, really simple. That's just that class, and all you have to do is call those to configure it. And you can set up as a global policy in the application. So rather than having to do it on every single endpoint, you just set it once, and they can all inherit the password rules. Really simple. So this is my favorite Laravel security feature. I absolutely love this one. This is signed routes. So the idea of a signed route is that when you need to give someone a URL that cannot be guessed or maybe cannot be changed. So for an unsubscribe link, for example, when you want their email address, but you don't want anyone to be able to unsubscribe anyone else, you can use a signed link. And then you pass in their email address or their ID as it is on the picture there. And then it'll generate a secure link from that, which will have a signature on it. Then when they click on the link, it has to validate the signature against the parameters in the URL. So to generate the link, all you do is that one line there. You can make it temporary, so set an expiry date, or you can just do signed route and then it's no expiry at all. Then all you need down here is this has valid signature, or you can use some middleware. And that validates the signature and checks all the query parameters. And if it doesn't pass, then it automatically rejects the request. Or in this case, we're going to abort 401. So that's all you need is those two lines, one up here, one down here, in order to actually do signed URLs, which is really, it makes it really easy, and I love them. They're a fantastic little feature. And PHP frameworks are full of this sort of conveniency things. They've got all sorts of little security features like that make it really easy to do stuff that was previously complicated. But now it's easy. As if you've just got two lines there to do that. And that's doing things like HMAC, hashing and such. Sorry. Okay, so to wrap up, as I said at the start, I spent last year auditing Laravel sites and auditing security of them. And so this is the top 5 things that I saw when doing my audits in terms of the security of modern PHP applications, specifically Laravel ones. And the top thing that I found that's a problem is the non-critical security misconfiguration. So we're talking missing security headers, content security policy, SRI, etc. And these are the things that are non-critical. So if they're missing, the site isn't vulnerable, but they're there in case something else happens. So you want SRIs, a sub-resource integrity, in case a third party gets compromised, because then it'll stop third party compromise from getting to your users, because it'll stop their scripts from running. You want the content security policy to stop cross-site scripting from happening on your site if there's another vulnerability in there. But on their own, it's not a problem if they're not there. So that's the top thing that's missing, is just a lack of awareness on what sort of security headers and things should be set there. But as I said, it's not a critical problem. I can't hack them if I find they're missing a CSP. The second thing is committed credentials. It's the most common one I find are actually Slack URLs, because they've got the key in the URL, and so they're always scattered across the code bases rather than pulled out into a config file. So I find Slack URLs a lot, and occasionally AWS credentials and fun things like that. Committed in the Git history and such, pretty easy to find. And this is probably pretty common across all the applications we work on, not just PHP. And again, committed credentials, you're not going to be able to hack a site from that alone, because you need to get to the repository. You need to get to their code to find the credentials to do anything with it. So it's not a critical problem unless someone else already gets in and gets access to the code. The third thing, outdated packages. We probably saw this one coming. It's a problem for everyone. Curiously enough, it's usually Node npm packages that are outdated on Laravel and PHP sites. Composer less so. I think updating npm is harder to remember and just more painful than updating Composer. Who here hasn't done a force upload delete of the Node modules repository before? Yeah, I thought so. We've all done it many times. Yeah, I realized as I was saying that was a very confusing way to say it. Yeah, but anyway, so outdated packages. So these three are probably pretty common across all applications. I'd be very surprised if someone who does pen testing and code audits comes up and says, no, I don't see that sort of problem in my applications. Now the next one, this one is actually a I can hack your site with it problem, but this is simple mistakes on single routes. So I'm not talking about where the developers don't understand security or they just lack an awareness of what authorization is. This is where the developer has simply forgotten a line. They've done a simple bug, simple mistake. And so say you've got a controller that's got 5 actions in it, and one of those is missing your authorization call that checks that the user is an admin. It happens occasionally, and it's easy to forget when you're writing down your code and you forget that one line. I find that all the time. And it often leads to IDORs and things like that. And you often also get with the signed routes that I mentioned before, they'll sometimes forget to actually validate the signature. So you'll generate a signed route, but if you're not validating the signature, then you just drop the signature and you can change whatever you want and you get in. So it's just these really simple bugs are the most problem things that I find. And you get that in everything that's not anything Laravel or PHP specific. And the one after that I find most common are actually cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, but it's usually in escalated or elevated accounts. So admins or say moderators. The most recent one I found was a video upload, so not video upload, so a video embed. So the moderator was able to embed a video from a weekly thing on the page, and the embed just accepted all HTML in order to do the video embed. So you can inject your own JavaScript in there. They did accept the risk because the moderators who had access knew what they were doing, and it was just part of what they had to do, and they had to support different video providers. So that was an acceptable risk. But that's generally what I find with cross-site scripting is it's in an elevated account. It doesn't, not usually in a lower level account. And that's all I really find, to be honest. It's occasionally I find some other things, but in general, it comes under, the ways to hack them generally comes under number 4. It's through the simple mistakes where they've just forgotten something simple here and there. And that's modern PHP. There's really not, when you're using a proper PHP language and you're following the best practices and working in the communities and using the tools that are provided, you don't generally find a lot of security vulnerabilities because it is secure, it is safe. It does have all these things in there for you to make it easy. So see, PHP isn't all that bad. Hopefully you come away knowing that. So thank you very much for coming. Are there any questions? Yep.
As a young developer who works, I help a lot of students and a lot of people go to bootcamp and stuff like that. And kind of thinks PHP is a grandpa language. I think this has at least changed my view on PHP, as I didn't know that it was this modern. But when I talk to everyone else, why would we learn PHP instead of JavaScript when the syntax is very similar to like Java, which we were always run into an enterprise, and where almost every job posting requires React, Angular, or Vue. I have never ever in my life seen any PHP framework in a job posting. So even though the language is great, why pick it over JavaScript if you're going to run into in React and stuff like that.
Yeah, okay, so the question was why pick PHP over other languages like JavaScript and such. I guess my defense for that would be that, when you're writing PHP, you still need to know JavaScript. So you still need the front-end language, but PHP was designed to run on the server. JavaScript wasn't. And so when you're building a language, an application that requires server-side components and server-side things, in my view is you should use a server-side language. A language that's designed to run in the server and designed to do things and is really good at it, rather than using a language that's kind of been hacked to run on the server and then like server-side rendering, really? Just use a server-side language and build a page. I guess, as you call it the grandpa language, and I guess, it isn't as flashy, as exciting as modern things, but it gets the job done and it gets the job done really well. And frameworks like Laravel make it really easy to build really cool sites. And there are some really nice things like Inertia and Livewire coming out for Laravel that take away the JavaScript for you. So you don't really need to do much of them because they do all that magic for you. And so then you can focus on writing your code in your application and doing the server-side things, and they do the front-end interface for you. I prefer PHP. I find it's really easy to use, and I think I'm trying to think of a better way to defend it. But I guess you've got to use the language that works for you. And I would say don't dismiss it if you haven't tried it, especially go try something like Laravel and see what you think of it. Yep.
So So the question was really, you were asking why not use JavaScript, which
Yeah.
is when we started talking about JavaScript being front end, PHP being server side.
Yep.
But PHP is still a language that lends itself towards server rendered pages, right? Which is, I guess that's really where developer taste comes in, and I would say personally, I am more of the what do you say? more of the opinion that I prefer the client server architecture where I build an API and a single page application, for example.
Yep.
And then my JavaScript can be as dumb as possible, and my server will do everything. I'm sure you can do that in PHP, but that's not really what people do, is it?
So just repeating for the recording. So the comment was saying that the guy prefers writing client server applications, and so yeah, keep like an API for the server, and then the client and SPAs and all those things. Well, the thing about PHP is it is really easy to build an API and build that side of things. And so if you want to go down the path of having an SPA and then a backend API, it's really easy to do that. And Laravel has a whole bunch of tools to do that for you. So building an API for an SPA in Laravel is a piece of cake. You don't have to use PHP as a rendering tool for rendering the pages. You can easily use it for APIs, and it works really well for that. And it's quite performant for that as well, because you can optimize your code based on the API architecture. So if you're going to go down that route of having your front end app and your back end app, use a back end language that is designed for back end. PHP is designed for back end, whether it be rendering HTML pages or just doing an API and doing API responses. It still works really well for that. So yeah, I think it works well for that. And there are, like, as I said, Laravel does provide all the tools you need to do an API in it. So yeah.
But then, as a follow-up,
Yep.
is it common that people do that?
So the follow-up question, is it common that people do that? And yes, I think it is. There is a lot of, one of the, what's it called? Laravel inertia I mentioned before. It's just inertia, it's not Laravel inertia. It's a way of building that in that Laravel apps in that way, where you build the front end all in Vue, and then it handles all of the complex Vue stuff for you. And then it uses Laravel as an API as the backend to power it. And so it is quite common for people to use Laravel as a backend and use PHP as a backend for SPAs. And there are various packages that you can install that give you easy JWTs and other session authentication tokens things to use it as a backend for an API. Yeah. So I think it is quite common. Yep.
So I guess the defensive argument for PHP is that PHP's language is all that bad, but mostly because of all the frameworks that are modern and do things for you. But you can still use all those old bootcamps in modern version of PHP if you only use the language, not all the frameworks, right? You can still write that SQL injection example you showed in 8.2.
Yep, yeah, so the comment was that, yeah, PHP, my defense is that PHP is all about the frameworks, and that's what gives it security. Yes, but you can do that in any language. I mean, because any language, if you're looking at the raw language without any frameworks at all, it gives you all the tools you need to shoot yourself in the foot. The thing about modern PHP, ignoring all the frameworks, is it gives you the classes and namespaces and a whole bunch of functions and features built into the core that you can use to build a secure application. You need to know what you're doing, though. But with the frameworks come in to make it easier for people who don't know what they're doing to get started and still get the security features. But if you know what you're doing, and this is the same with any framework, any language at all, if you know what you're doing, you can use the raw framework and write a secure application. Just the modern PHP, so PHP 7 and 8 specifically, give you a whole bunch of the tools to make it really easy. And you've got like that filter input function, which is part of the core. So you've got input validation built into the core. So that's already a tool you can use straight away. You don't need a framework for that. And I know the PHP common library has a huge amount of functions and features in there. Well, something like JavaScript has a very limited set in its core, and you need to pull in 50 gazillion packages via NPM in order to do anything in JavaScript. But PHP has so many different things built into the core. So, I mean, you could argue that there's more in PHP core to build an application than there is in other languages, based on my limited understanding of languages. Yep.
You seem to be very integrated into the PHP community, so you
Yep.
can answer which was one of the reasons that I thought PHP was kind of dead. If you Google, as you showed yourself, if you Google, like, I think it was how to like, read from a file or something like that.
Yep.
In PHP, you get all kinds of insecure code for like something like W3 school, which is pretty common to immediately go to W3, but they have the answer.
Yeah.
Paste the code and paste it. How is, if the PHP community is so strong and builds such a strong framework, how is that still online as like the first thing that everyone sees? How is that even possible if the community is so strong? Like if you Google that in Java, you don't get immediately you find a SQL injection or ability by Google how to do Spring Boot or something like that.
Yes, the question is, how are there still insecure tutorials so easy to find on search engines? I'm guessing the blame there falls on the search engines rather than the community itself, because there are, I can point to like heaps of different resources for PHP that teach how to do proper PHP and proper code. So as for why Google still returns those really old tutorials first, I don't know. That's just how they work. Yeah, I don't really have a good answer to that one. I mean, it's because you can't take down someone else's site. I mean, people have that one I put up there with the SQL injection. I think that's an example that Troy Hunt uses in his workshop. And he's tried multiple times to leave comments on that guy's blog about how it's insecure. The person just deletes the comments. So the person running that site knows full well that it's vulnerable and they don't care. They're just keeping it up there because it's getting traffic to their site. They must have ads or something. So I'd suggest that the insecure tutorials are up there, are either done through a set and forget mentality. Someone's forgotten it's a thing and they're not checking it, or they're getting ad revenue or something, or something like that. I don't know. But in terms of, I think it's the search engine's fault that that they're so easy to find when they're so outdated. And it's probably why PHP Fractal About Design keeps getting talked about as well, because it's really easy to find, even though it's old and outdated. But the person that wrote it keeps it up there, and the search engines keep finding it. So, yeah. And if there's something from Google here, we could ask them. Don't know if that really answers the question, but hopefully it does. Yep.
Do a follow-up.
Yep.
Again, from the point of view of somebody who is just in it for the money as a developer, right?
Yep.
A lot of from a Java, if you want to get into that, right? It's React, Angular, Vue. It does all the applications. If you want to do some Java, you need Spring Boot, you need Java. If you want to do it in public sector, you learn Java. I haven't seen a PHP position like this. I haven't heard about Laravel before you showed it to me. I was like, there's a framework for PHP? Okay. So I thought this was WordPress.
Yeah.
You are more into that space. Do you see a lot of job posting? Again, I only look at Norway, right? So in Norway, I haven't seen it. Do you see like any international, like, is there new PHP positions getting pushed out in some forums that just, I don't, maybe because I'm not in those forums, right?
Yeah, there are heaps of big sites that use Laravel and other frameworks. In PHP. So yeah, there are definitely jobs going up for PHP and companies that are hiring PHP. Governments tend to go for the more corporate type language just because governments do government stuff. And that's just what governments do. And also large companies, the older ones generally get, again, kind of gravitate towards the more corporate languages. It's just kind of what seems to happen. So you find PHP more in smaller shops, and you get like agencies and such using PHP and that sort of thing. But yeah, there are definitely PHP jobs and things around if you know where to look. I guess it's just a case of looking. But I think a lot of the PHP community probably looks for jobs in different locations as well. And so, you might not be seeing them in those spaces because the companies are advertising in different places.
But
yeah.
Is it like Laravel, or is it like, we have legacy PHP code that needs to be maintained, please be like... You get all sorts. Yeah, you definitely get the whole, we've got legacy code thing, but you've also get, when you're looking for Laravel developers, Symfony developers, Code Igniter, that sort of thing. So there's definitely an active community, and there's definitely jobs and things around for it. So it's not as if it's everyone working in it are the only ones who are ever going to do it again sort of thing. There's definitely growing, and there's definitely that in there. But you hear more about some of the other languages and some of the other things just because, I don't know, it's
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, it could just be there's not much PHP up in this part of the world as well, depending on what sort of jobs you're looking for. So yeah. Cool. We might call that a session. Thank you very much.